So now they see this is interesting. When we do a lot of reading, and we read descriptions of great artists playing by their colleagues, Schindler has a blow-by-blow description of Beethoven playing this. That sonata, if you would read the description, Beethoven was playing in New York, is it? He's playing like Brahms. He's playing Beethoven like Brahms. Here's Schindler. At bar 7, it was as though he beheld the eyes of his beloved, and he suddenly slackened the tempo. And the description of the playing is every few bars with a different tempo.
In Schnabel's editions, he writes every few passages or so, but new metronome marking too.
Clifford Curzon told me, he was his favorite pupil. Schnabel was walking with him on Central Park once. They took walks together. He said, a lovely young woman came to play for me today, my Appassionata Sonata. And she changed the tempo every measure. I said, why are you changing the tempo? Mr. Schnabel, I studied it from your edition. So Schnabel told Clifford he was going to have that in the entire edition wiped out. He was going to take it all away and make a new edition, and he died.
I think he intended those tempo changes to be subtle and imperceptible.
Gentle rubato.
But also not perceptible as a change of tempo per se.
Absolutely so, of course.
Change of mood, of texture.
He meant well, but he created a problem. Anyway, did you hear what I was doing on that D flat?
Yeah.
Okay, go to the E flat. You will try, maybe you will succeed.
One more try.
Okay. Time? Do you agree that that should be delayed?
Yes. Some might say this is too flexible for Beethoven.
You're playing slower now than you did before. Boom, 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 boom. Are you against doing that?
No. Not in principle against anything.
So I'm very interested to know what you do here. Okay. So, of course, these are just dots, right, without a slur. But see, dots are grossly misunderstood, I believe, by a lot of pianists. They can be like this, but they can be like this too. See, with a little vibrato with the pedal. And do you like this?
No.
Well, that's what
It's hard to
did.
play really soft.
No, but you did it without the pedal.
Okay, I'm going for something.
Pedal each note. Pedal.
Every one of these notes?
No, every
Each eighth
eighth note. No, not the one pedal for this. Now change. Isn't that better?
I was trying to do something extreme. I was trying to get a legato.
Oh, without the pedal, okay. No, it's too dry.
Sometimes I like dry.
All right.
Because I like clarity in Beethoven, and I respect your instruction. I wonder sometimes if I'm not obscuring certain notes a little too much for Beethoven style.
this is very valid, what you're talking about now.
Наоборот, ладно, участки.
Hey! I can show you how to go from zero to mastering the piano up to 150 times faster than traditional music education methods.
Ну это и было, оно и было самое, что он про себя думает.
Final Fantasy VII. The utterance of these three words compels reverence from every member of the gaming community. Even if you personally are not a fan of FF7 or don't rank it as high as the other Final Fantasy games, you cannot deny the impact this game has had on the gaming medium. Every artistic discipline that is represented in this game was state-of-the-art in 1997, and in some respects it still is today. The characters, the world building, the music, and let us not forget how mind-blowing it was to play a Final Fantasy game in 3 dimensions back in the day. I recently finished going through it for the first time, and I have to say that I was blown away by its presentation. In fact, out of the 3 Final Fantasy games that I've played so far, it might be my favorite. Granted, this preference is in part due to the game's lore. Though Final Fantasy X and 9 had wonderful concepts and storytelling, I find the lore in Final Fantasy VII to be the most expertly crafted that I have witnessed thus far. Like the other 2 games, Final Fantasy VII synthesized different religious inspirations in order to birth its own unique worlds. Unlike those other 2 games, though, it seems that FF7 chose to juggle a greater number of inspirations and still succeeded in doing so. I will note that Final Fantasy IX is apparently an amalgamation of inspirations from the previous 8 games, so maybe my appreciation of that game will surpass FF7 in the future. For now, however, the superior synthesis seems to be with FF7. Just like I did with Final Fantasy X and 9, I will elucidate FF7's religious inspirations so we may develop a deeper understanding and appreciation for the game. Admittedly, this is going to be a bit tricky. Obviously, Final Fantasy VII is a game that has been examined and analyzed backwards and forwards. Anybody who is a hardcore fan of the game is already well aware of its ties to things like the Hebrew Kabbalah, Norse mythology, Gnosticism, and classical Asian iconography. If you, the viewer, consider yourself to be a hardcore fan of FF7, 70 to 80% of this video will feel like a retread. Nonetheless, that means 20% of this video might contain discoveries that nobody else seems to have noticed or spoken up about, at least in the research I have done. Before we get to the original perspective, allow me to set things up by going over
Я ничего не понимаю, прощай, секунду.
Спасибо за ваше обращение. Пожалуйста, оцените качество работы сотрудника контактного центра от 1 до 5.
Какого центра? Че, ты оборзела, что ли? Кто звонил вообще? Кто звонит? Народ, паразиты. Сволочь. О, Отер, привет, Отер. Хай. Reloading. I need to reload. My camera is off. Okay. Говёшь какая-то звонила опять. Говёшь какие-то. Ну это нас фигать. Да надо. Галюшка это нет. Один тот у меня. Один тот у меня.
The FF7 fan community. Obviously, if you're going to talk about the religious influences of this game, the first thing that immediately comes to mind is Sephiroth, and how his name references a concept in the Lurian Kabbalah, a form of Jewish Gnosticism. Before I get to the concept of Sephiroth, though, I'll provide a quick recap on Gnosticism. Like I explained in my video on FF10, Gnosticism is a marriage of Judeo-Christian concepts with psychological experience. For instance, the struggle of trying to live in the 2nd century caused some Gnostics to believe that the world was not, in fact, ruled by a benevolent god, but an ignorant and incompetent one called the Demiurge. Though the Gnostics believed in a benevolent god, it was not aware of humanity and their plight. This concept of the Demiurge was reflected in the creature known as Sin in Final Fantasy X, a false god who mistreated those it ruled over. With that addressed, I shall now explain the Judeo-Gnostic concept of the
Да ну у вас, ну наоборот, да. Да наоборот.
I'm probably the opposite of Chopin in the sense that I am extroverted. I grew up in the 20th century hearing extroverted people like Rubinstein play Chopin so beautifully. So my first model of Chopin was hearing him do it at Carnegie Hall, which is not exactly intimate, and yet I had a very intimate experience, which is part of the miracle of art and music, that you can actually have a deep, personal, intimate experience with a person you don't know with 2,700 people at the same time.
How much of Chopin is a classicist and how much of Chopin is a romantic? Is it 50-50? Is it depend on your mood, which day?
Hi there, I'm Alex. Почему-то все русские делают эту ошибку в английском языке. Когда мы что-то не понимаем,
Ну она хочет смотреть это все. Вот вот нельзя смотреть. Заблокирую сразу. Они безмозглые просто все, наверное, явно безмозглые. Да, кстати, наоборот. Да. Ну, это он имел в виду. Ну, что-то даст. Я время свое не теряю зря, опасно, а? Ну, он тебе говорит. Да, наоборот, да. Ты про себя и думай тогда.
Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about this book, Canon, the Virtuoso Pianist. Have you ever wondered why pianists can move their fingers so fast, so precisely? Were they born with it? No, we were not born with special fingers. We trained for it. In my studio, there are several technique books that students do beforehand. So by the time they get to hand-on, they know how to play with good finger shape and do certain techniques already. But some teachers use hand-on from the very beginning. It depends on your teacher. In this video, I'm going to talk about how I practice hand-on and how I want my students to practice hand-on as well. So you can see what it takes to gain virtuosic piano technique. And also, I don't have to keep explaining the same exercises to every student who starts hand-on in our studio. In this video, I'm going to specifically talk about exercises from number 1 till number 20. And all of them goes like this. Hello everyone, my name is Akira. I'm a pianist, piano teacher, and a translator who lived in 3 different countries. On my channel, I'm posting videos of my performances and topics related to and not related to music, whatever I find interesting. So please subscribe and hit the bell button next to it so you won't miss my future videos. And don't forget to hit the like button so YouTube will know I'm putting out good content. So I'll give you some time to do that right now. My video on how to practice hand-on became very popular over the last few months, and a lot of people have asked, what books do you use before hand-on? In this video, I'm going to introduce the books I use for technical training before hand-on, and I'm also going to talk about what to focus on some of the exercises, so you can incorporate those in your own practice or teaching. So let's begin. I know there are teachers who give hand-on to 3-year-olds and tell them to go practice 5 hours every day. Although it may work very well in some parts of the world, that hasn't worked very well for me. Although it may work very well hand-on to 3-year-olds and tell them to go practice 5 hours every day. Although it may work very well in some parts of the world, that hasn't worked very well for me. So instead, I have certain routine I follow so that my students can build up their skill and be ready to start playing hand-on. The very first technique book I use is this. Yes, a piece of paper. But it's not just a piece of paper. It's a piece of paper that has musical alphabets and pentascale exercise. As of now, we give free trial lessons to all the new students, and this is a piece of paper I use in the trial lesson. In these trial lessons, I go over all the basics, like how to sit at the piano, keyboard topology, and how to play the keys. These are what I consider as the key to success in piano studies, and I teach that in the very first lesson, and that's free. No wonder musicians struggle to make living. Anyway, if you haven't seen these videos, please go ahead and check them out. After the student successfully performs the 5-finger exercise on this paper, then I start them on the method book. And I'll talk about these method books I use for my lessons in a separate video. But I'm going to focus on the technique books today. After 6 months to 1 year, when they finish the first set of the method books, that's when I start them on this technique book. And that book is...
Lotus silk is one of the rarest fabrics in the world. Produced only in small scale across Cambodia, Myanmar, and more recently Vietnam, this natural fibre is only extracted by a few skilled craftspeople across the world. But making this silk isn't easy. Extracting enough lotus silk for one scarf can take 2 months, and the final product can cost 10 times as much as regular silk. So just how is it made? And what makes it so expensive? Phan Thi Thuan's family have been making silk for generations, growing and harvesting the threads from silkworms themselves to create luxury garments. But making lotus silk is different. Silk usually comes from silkworms. They're kept on wide trays and need to be fed almost 24 hours a day with mulberry leaves. The caterpillars delicately spin threads to create their cocoons, and it can take hundreds of silkworms to make a kilo of silk. But while the insects require careful looking after, they do most of the hard work themselves. The key difference between the bright yellow silk and the paler lotus version is that every single strand of lotus silk must be extracted by hand.
Tơ sen thì nó khác với cái lụa tơ tằm. Là tơ sen thì mình phải rút sợi tơ nó là thân mộc. Mà sợi tơ tằm kia nó có cái phần cứng hơn cái sợi tơ sen là vì nó nhờ vào cái nực của con tằm nó qua một cái tiếng kêu của nó rút từ ruột nó ra cái
Жизнь одна только пролетает, и все пролетело, и все. Ну, да. Вот это он имел в виду. Вот и есть. Так наоборот, да. Так вот я, ну и что дальше-то? Ну, наоборот. Ну хорошо, мне даже самому даже как-то, да. Ну ладно, я посмотрю, да.
Сегодня благотворительные организации помогают людям повсюду.
Ну да. Ну не знаю, есть, не есть. Только мне поставь. Понял? Ну, наверное, нет просто. Да. Я даже не знаю.
Final
Вот смотри,
Fantasy
какой у тебя любимый
VII.
был алкоголь, когда ты был алкоголиком? Зачем?
The utterance of these three words
Не знаю.
compels
Как
reverence
бы.
from every
Ну,
member
зачем
of the
это?
gaming community. Even if you personally are not a fan of FF7 or don't rank it as high as the other Final Fantasy games, you cannot deny the impact this game has had on the
Ну, я просто, ну я...
7. In the Lurian Kabbalah, but an ignorant and incompetent one called the Demiurge. Though the Gnostics believed in a benevolent god, it was not aware of humanity and their plight. This concept of the Demiurge was reflected in the creature known as Sin in Final Fantasy X, a false god who mistreated those it ruled over. With that addressed, I shall now explain the Judeo-Gnostic concept of the Sephiroth and its heavy relation to Final Fantasy VII. In the Lurian Kabbalah, there is what is known as the 10 emanations, or 10 Sephirot, of Ein Sof. Ein Sof is one of the many Jewish terms that refer to the highest power. God, Yahweh, Jehovah, the Infinite, whatever you want to call it. At the beginning of time, Ein Sof shined a light out from his eyes into the dark void. This light coalesced into a being known as Adam Kadmon, an anthropomorphic being that was basically the first man ever created, a being created in the image of Ein Sof. Then from Adam Kadmon's eyes shone another ray of light into the void. This ray of light was Adam Kadmon's essence, which he poured into 10 vessels. These 10 vessels, plus Adam Kadmon at the top, make up what is known as the Sephirotic tree. In the simplest terms, the Sephirotic tree is the body of the primordial man split up into 10 segments. 7 of these segments were unable to contain the light that Adam Kadmon poured into them and shattered, an event that is known in the Jewish Kabbalah as Shevirat HaKalim, the shattering of the vessels. The shards of these vessels, along with the light that was contained within, spread throughout the void and created our universe. That's what the Sephiroth/Sephirot is. But we have yet to establish any connection to FF7 beyond the fact that the villain has the same name. What's interesting to me is that in all my research into the game, I never came across any connection to FF7 beyond the fact that the villain has the same name. What's interesting to me is that in all my research into the game, I never came across anybody trying to relate the concept of Adam Kadmon to Sephiroth and his ultimate mission of becoming one with the planet Gaia. Check this out. In the Kabbalah, there's this concept known as tikkun, a Hebrew word which roughly translates to restitution, reparation, or reunion. Supposedly, it is the Kabbalist's duty to reunify the light that fell from the shattered vessels with the body of Adam Kadmon. When this happens, the human race will reunite with the body of Adam Kadmon and enter an eternal paradise. I cannot help but notice that this shares a lot of similarity to Sephiroth's ultimate goal, as well as Professor Hojo's reunion theory. I'll begin by addressing the latter. According to Professor Hojo, every being that was infected with Sephiroth's cells, and by extension the Genova cells, would seek to reunite and return to the main body. We see this happen with those who were infected, including Cloud and the other Sephiroth clones at the North Crater. Following this, Sephiroth would attain enough power in order to carry out the final stage of his plan, the one that he revealed at the Temple of the Ancients. Sephiroth's ultimate plan is to become one with the planet Gaia and to rule over every soul. To rule over every soul, he will merge with the life stream. The union of every soul on planet Gaia within Sephiroth's body is very similar to the reunion, or tikkun, of every soul within Adam Kadmon. If there is a connection here, then it is very appropriate that Sephiroth was named the way he is. After all, the Sephiroth/Sephirotic tree is synonymous with Adam Kadmon. There's a bit more proof to support this perspective, but yes, the Sephiroth, appropriate that Sephiroth was named the way he is. After all, the Sephiroth/Sephirotic tree is synonymous with Adam Kadmon. There's a bit more proof to support this perspective, but it lays outside our current discussion of the Sephirotic tree. I wish to stay on this subject a little while longer because there are other things that relate to the Kabbalah and Judaism in the game. Firstly, Tifa's bar, seventh heaven, is a direct reference to the Jewish belief that there are 7 heavens. The 7th of these heavens is the highest heaven, where God and his angels are located, known as the Seraphim. A seraph is a 6-winged angel, a being that bears a striking resemblance to the being that Sephiroth transforms into at the end of the game, a being with 6 wings. Speaking of Tifa, her name might have originated from one of the 10 Sephiroth, the one designated Tiferet. The traits that are associated with this vessel include beauty, compassion, and balance. I should also note that there are different spellings for this vessel, including Tiferet with an A, as well as Tifereth. This leads me to believe that Aerith got her name from this vessel as well. In other words, both Tifa and Aerith represent 2 sides of the same vessel, in name and in temperament. These are the only other relations that I put stock in. There are a couple of others that I don't necessarily believe, but I'll present them for the sake of fun. Firstly, the Tiferet vessel is meant to balance the forces of 2 other Sephiroth, Haud and Netzach. If the names Tifa and Aerith came from Tiferet, I cannot help but think that the character Zack's name came from Netzach, and Cloud's name came from Haud. Cloud, yeah. It's especially appropriate seeing that Aerith is technically Zack's girlfriend and Tifa is Cloud's girlfriend. There might be something there, there might be not.
Spoiler.
And Tifa is Cloud's girlfriend.
Да просто интересно, я ни разу так не делал.
Saying that Aerith is technically Zack's girlfriend and Tifa is Cloud's girlfriend. Is Cloud's girlfriend. There might be something there. There might be not. Then there's the Jewish concept of gematria, which some Final Fantasy fans have tried to link to FF7. In the simplest terms, gematria is the Kabbalist belief that within the Hebrew language is a special code sent to them from God. They attempt to decipher the code by linking each letter of the Hebrew language with a numerical value. Depending on what letters are in a name, those letters will add up to a specific number. Now, if I go to gematrix.org or gematrinator.com, I can calculate the numerical value of various names. If I take the name of the Sephirotic vessel known as Chokmah, the number that pops out is 118. Guess what Cloud's birthday is? August 11th, the 8th month, the 11th day. But wait, it gets better. If I put in Tiferet into the calculator, the number that pops up is 305. What's Tifa's birthday? May the 3rd, the 5th month, the 3rd day. Now with this said, I don't actually buy that the guys behind Final Fantasy VII actually put this much thought into this whole thing. The guy 5th drew, if I the 8th month, the 11th day, said thought into this whole thing. Why? Well, you see, I came across this linking of gematria to Final Fantasy VII when a wiki entry said that the gematria of the Sephirotic vessel Chesed was 72, and that Aerith's birthday was February 7th. However, if I go to these calculating websites, I do not see the number 72 pop up anywhere, even when I take other forms of gematria into consideration. This leads me to believe that the numerical values are pure coincidence, but hey, it's still fun to think about. With that fun stuff out of the way, let's move beyond the Kabbalah and into full-on Gnosticism, of which Kabbalah is only a subcategory. In the Valentinian Gnostic system, there is a being known as Sophia. Sophia was one of 30 emanations of God, contrasted with the 10 in the Sephirotic system. In the Valentinian system, these emanations weren't known as Sephiroth, but in the emanations, there is a being known as Sophia. Sophia was one of 30 emanations of God, contrasted with the 10 in the Sephirotic system. In the Valentinian system, these emanations weren't known as Sephiroth, but as aeons. Now, where have we heard the name aeon before? Anyways, Sophia was unlike the 29 other aeons. She wanted to leave heaven and birth something of her own in the formless void. It is here where she birthed the Demiurge, the concept of the ignorant, incompetent god that was reflected in the character of Sin in Final Fantasy X. With the concept of Sophia and the Demiurge, I can draw two potential parallels to Final Fantasy VII. First, in the case of Jenova, she was like Sophia in that she fell from the infinite heavens above and was, in part, responsible for the creation of Sephiroth. The implanting of her cells into the body of Sephiroth is, in a way, a form of begetting a malevolent Demiurge, which Sephiroth tries to become at the end of the game. The second potential parallel is that Jenova could be likened to Ein Sof, who begat Adam Kadmon. As I briefly pointed out earlier, one of the names that is given to the Jewish god is Jehovah, which is clearly similar to Jenova. In a way, Jenova begetting Sephiroth runs parallel to Jehovah begetting Adam Kadmon. And remember what I said before, Sephiroth and Adam Kadmon are basically the same thing. I will conclude this video by briefly addressing this long-standing controversy between FF7 and FF10. Most hardcore fans will know that there is this implied connection between the two games that none of the original creators want to canonize, aside from one. According to the Japanese FFX2 Ultimania guide, the lead scenario writer for both FF7 and FF10, Kazushige Nojima, states outright that in his mind, both games share the same universe. In FFX2, there is a character that you can come across named Shinra, who speaks about extracting energy from the far plane to use as a source of energy. This, of course, reflects what the Shinra Corporation does in FF7 by extracting Mako energy from the life stream. Keep in mind, though, that Nojima's perspective isn't canon. According to the director of FF7, Yoshinori Kitase, Nojima's perspective is just his, quote, unofficial secret history. So whether or not Final Fantasy X and X-2 are official prequels to FF7 remains to be. Fantasy X, just his quote of FF7, Yoshinori Kitase, Nojima's perspective is just his quote unofficial secret history. So whether or not Final Fantasy X and X-2 are official prequels to FF7 remains to be seen. Although a certain Easter egg in the Final Fantasy VII Remake implies that this connection might eventually be confirmed. We'll see. As for my personal opinion, even if they aren't officially connected, the concepts used in Final Fantasy VII and X are, nonetheless, virtually the same. They just go by different names. The souls of the dead in Final Fantasy VII return to the life stream, where the souls of the dead in Final Fantasy X return to the far plane. Both the life stream and the far plane exist inside their respective planets. Energy can be extracted from both and used for material purposes. In the case of FF7, that energy is Mako, which is used as a fuel source. In Final Fantasy X, I argued that the energy is the Pyreflies. On top of this, both Mako and Pyreflies can crystallize into physical form. In Final Fantasy X, the Pyreflies crystallize into spheres. In Final Fantasy VII, the Mako crystallizes into materia. With this said, it doesn't necessarily mean that 10 and 7 are connected. After all, spiritual energy was used as a fuel source in Final Fantasy IX in the form of mist, the residual essence of souls. Does that mean that Final Fantasy IX is connected to the other games as well? It's impossible to say. Nonetheless, the concept of spiritual energy that resides in all living things is not only consistent across all the Final Fantasy games, but it's consistent across a lot of cultures in real life as well. In Final Fantasy X, the Pyreflies are used as a fuel source. Both the life stream and the far plane exist inside their respective planets. Energy can be extracted from both and used for material purposes. In the case of FF7, that energy is Mako, which is used as a fuel source. In Final Fantasy X, I argued that the energy is the Pyreflies. On top of this, both Mako and Pyreflies can crystallize into physical form. In Final Fantasy X, the Pyreflies crystallize into spheres. In Final Fantasy VII, the Mako crystallizes into materia. With this said, it doesn't necessarily mean that 10 and 7 are connected. After all, spiritual energy was used as a fuel source in Final Fantasy IX in the form of mist, the residual essence of souls. Does that mean that Final Fantasy IX is connected to the other games as well? It's impossible to say. Nonetheless, the concept of spiritual energy that resides in all living things is not only consistent across all the Final Fantasy games, but it's consistent across a lot of cultures in real life as well. Whether it's the scintilla vitae or aqua permanens of the alchemists, the chi of the Chinese, or the divine spark in Gnosticism, it's all the same idea. It just goes by a different name. There is even more to Final Fantasy VII's religious inspiration, but for the sake of time and originality, I will refer you to other works that discuss those. If you want to learn more about how Norse mythology influenced Final Fantasy VII, I suggest reading a book by Maurice J. Gallagher, titled Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII. I'll also point to a few other worthwhile videos in the description box below. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. If you like this video, please hit that like button. That helps me out enormously. Also, if you like the work I'm doing here, where I go above and beyond your average game theory video, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put a link to my Patreon in the description box below.
Я просто, ну как бы да, понимаешь, себя что-то как бы защищаться глупо. То есть да, потому что везде жизнь всегда, да. То есть надо просто выбирать. Это мужское. То есть везде броуновское движение, каждый сам по себе. Ну как джунгли, да, каждый, да. Типа, ты выбираешь то, что тебе. И все, ты с ума сойдешь всех их убивать там, или порабощать, это вообще. Он тебя понял, да. Это все как бы. Даже если ты супер Дарт Вейдер, такой. То есть как бы все равно постарел, все, кардык. То есть как бы, к примеру, вот, короче, жизнь против тебя будет, короче, понимаешь, обязательно в тебе же самом самое смешное, да? Жизнь, ну ты же жизнь тоже, просто ты думаешь что-то, да наоборот. Ну ладно, это себе просто тогда. Ну ладно. Ну и что будет? И какой выход? И что дальше будешь делать? Он тебе просто я и говорил, так наоборот. Да. Ну он это о себе так думает. Да. Понимаешь, порабощение это временное, да, я про себя, да, ну то есть на материальной базе какой-то, да, то есть, да. Даже если ты, смотри, ты раб, тебя насилуют, там, начинают себе, она тебе так думает просто. Ну ладно. Тебя там, ну она о себе думала просто так, да, она про себя так думает просто, да. Ну вот наоборот, так это, ну нет, наоборот, она про тебя так думает просто, да. Что за бред, блин, да. Ну короче, если даже ты раб, там все равно, то есть только трудом, да, то есть, ну да. То есть труд ты работаешь, все, больше ничего, да, то есть, ну ты раб, короче, например, на плантациях где-то там, да, понимаешь, да, то есть трудом, знаний познать, да. Насилием ты ничего не докажешь никому вообще никак. Ты никак не, да, то есть, да, жизнь свою проживешь зря, если еще вообще проживешь сколько-нибудь. После этого, понимаете. Ну, я понял. Но это он имеет в виду. Ну, а ты так не считаешь, да, наоборот, да. Ну, вот это, ну, скорее, ну, так вот, ну, он о себе так думает просто. Труд, наработка просто. Надо ну и чё, да. То есть, ну и чё ты будешь нарабатывать тогда, да. Да, ну, это он имеет в виду. Да, ну, вот это и думал сам, да. Я тебе точно говорю, то есть иначе, ну он тебя просто, да, то есть, ну тебе придется больше работать, значит ты более достойный будешь, да, понимаешь. Да, понимаю. Да. Типа того. Ну, опять же, ну и чё? Он тебя понял уже просто. Да. Ну и ладно, ну и чё ты хочешь-то? А ты чё хотел вообще? Ну не хоти тогда ничего, иди нахер, да. Ну что тебе надо? Нормально играет она просто, да. Да. Ну, а на себе-то? Что ты такое? Да. Поймешь, короче, долгий разговор, да. То есть, как бы, да, ну, я понял, наоборот, только да, да. Вот это и есть он самый. Так нет, это же, ну и ты так не думаешь, что ли? Да, в обществе, да. Нет, смотри, ты какой-то глупый человек, он тебе про себя говорит это самое, да. Ну вот это он имеет в виду. Но он о себе так думает, да наоборот, да наоборот. Уеду в деревню, буду работать. Да ты лох, чмо ты просто, понимаешь? Буду работать, говорит, для себя, в деревню уеду. Что ты сумасшедший? Да, понимаешь. Это точно я тебе говорю, это да, слабак просто. Смотри, если мужик, ты, например, доктор или какой-нибудь, ну кто-нибудь, учитель, доктор там, да неважно кто, мужик, профессионал. И ты едешь в деревню зачем? Потому что ты хреносос. Потому что нормальный учитель идет создавать учительство, науку, понимаешь? Да, то есть, а это хреносос, блин. И на жену свою, у меня жена, потому что, что у тебя жена? У меня рожает, она, да, понимаете, да. Но она тебе так говорит, нет. Жена у тебя почему свирепая и почему она не женственная? Почему она не добрая? Почему она, да? Потому что ты не мужик, вот и все, блин. Понимаешь, да. Ну, он на себе так думает только, да. Ну, нет. Ну, да нормально как раз, да. Ну, я имею в виду, что ну ты не можешь быть не мужиком. В смысле, ты свою жизнь, как бы мужскую, у тебя мужское тело, ты живешь как женщина. Представляешь, да, понимаю. Как тебе объяснить-то? То есть, ну, она поняла тебя, да. Да, она поняла тебя просто. Ну, наоборот, только. Ну, она поняла тебя. Она себе это поняла, да. Наоборот, ну, она себе так думает, да наоборот, да. А, ну и это что, все знают, что ли? Так нет, а зачем тебе уезжать в деревню-то? Так да, потому что! Ну, понимаете, я просто, да. Ну, она о себе так думает, потому что, да. Нет, женщина... Да, значит! Женщине! Не надо никуда... Ну, да, достал уже просто. Достал, ну, ладно, тебе так, наоборот, да, ну ладно. Ладно, наоборот, да. Не касается. Нет, в том-то и штука, да пошел к черту. Ладно, штука.
I can teach you music 150 times faster than traditional methods. I can teach you in a way which is fail-proof, or you don't pay. Yeah. How can I stand here and say something so crazy? Well, the reason is because I do this every day with thousands of people around the world. People that might be just like you.
Вот это она имела в виду. Ну, это себе он так думает просто, да. Да. Он тебе так думает. Ну, она про себя так думает просто, да. есть он себе так да, да, понял. Да, да, наоборот ли? Да, да, наоборот ли? Да, да, да. Ну, да, да, да. Что ты хотел узнать? Я тебе просто говорю, я тебе точно заявляю, что можно жить не воюя и вообще ничего. То есть добрую жизнь можно нормальную, человеческую, да, можно вести, и она тебе понравится. Понимаешь? То есть, да, то есть для всех людей, да, да, она тебя поняла, да, 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 да. Ну, она себе так говорит, да, ну, просто, да. Ну, это он имеет в виду. Все остальное, специальное вранье, все остальное, просто ложь остальное все. Да. Вранье просто и все, да. Ну, наоборот, значит, да. Это она имеет в виду. То есть можешь радоваться с легкой, облегченной душой, судьбой, как угодно. Да, 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 понимаю. Да, да, да. Все создашь сам, значит, так, как угодно, ты можешь какие угодно слова говорить. Создай! Да что? Ну, он о себе так говорит, потому что... Да, просто жить это не жрать. Это, да, жизнь для человека это не еда, понимаешь? Вот как не понимаю, опять все обобрался. Ты достал уже, ты имбецил, что ли, не понимаешь, что ли? Да, для человеческого, для гуманоида жизнь, она в другом проявляется. Не в том, что ты можешь кушать. Это для амебы кушать, это... Какая же трагедия, пошел нахер! Поняла тебя, идиот, сука, пошел нахер, мразь. Это для какого-то животного кушать, это сложно, понимаешь? Даже для животных это не сложно, у них уже другие проблемы, потому что... Да, амебе вот, наверное, у нее кишечника нет, потому что у амебы. Да, понимаете, да. То есть, да, то есть, здравствуйте, добро пожаловать, да, поняла, наоборот, просто нет, просто, вот я про себя говорю, просто, да, то есть для человеческого, для гуманоидов, это, то есть, как бы ты даже можешь практически, ты будешь на иждивении находиться, понимаешь, как, я не знаю, как у обезьян, например, или у других животных, если ты в клане, и ты не добываешь еду, ты в улье сидишь, трутень, тебя выкинуть оттуда надо, да, поняла. Ну, ты функцию осеменения, ну, она про себя так думает просто, да наоборот. Ну, она поняла тебя просто, да, то есть, людям мы друг друга не убиваем! Да, наш социум не для этого предназначен, да, понимает она, да, то есть, мы почему-то инвалидов не убиваем, хотя их надо вроде, нахера они сдались? Ну, там, ДЦПшники всяких, нахера они сдались, их надо убивать, они зря еду едят, общество ничего не производит, значит, что-то производят. Ну не убиваем мы так, потому что, да, поняла, да, наоборот, да, но это твои проблемы, меня это не касается, они еще им деньги даже платят, понимаешь? Ну она о тебе так говорит, ну поняла тебя просто, да. Ну заткнись, пошли к черту, я не инвалид, это во-вторых, да, она про себя так думает. Я тебе просто объясняю, что гуманоиды, это не джунгли, ну то есть как бы это не менее нормально говорит она уже так, да, ну поняла, да. Ну то есть я тебе объясняю, что можно жить, просто понимаешь, да, но наоборот, так нет, наоборот, она это имела в виду, да, то есть, но жить это не значит бытовать свой, ну то есть как бы, да, это не то, что ты с телевизора видишь там рекламу, да, то есть, да. Жить это значит, если ты мужик, надо постоянно что-то делать, доказывать, заказывать, я не знаю, что тебе надо от меня? Жизнь это работа, понимаешь? Ну иди нахер, заткнись, мразь, да, поняла тебя уже просто. Че хочешь, что и делаешь, тебе непонятно что ли? Да, вот что ты, да, ты просто делаешь, да, вот просто, всю жизнь делать, да, бля, да. Вот я про себя и говорил, да, ну, он про тебя и думает так, да. Ну это он имел в виду. Меня это не касается, понимаешь? Я тебе скажу, да, это твои проблемы, блин, я просто понял уже, да. Так ну так и есть, если реальность так устроена, вот что хочешь, это уже, да, понимает он тебя, да. Это ты не хочешь делать, это ты просто кому-то мстишь, понимаешь? Это ты зависимый философ просто, ты не мужик, значит. Ну даже с этого ты начал, а дальше что будешь делать, да, понимаю, да. Ну, хорошо, как ты в эту ситуацию попал? Давай не будем, короче. То есть, как бы я поняла уже просто все. Да. Для женщины это значит заниматься, чтобы ее занимались, в нее любовью занимались, и ей туда, и чтобы в ней заводились дети от этого процесса. Да. Потому что это здорово, биологично, и это правильно, да. И они вроде как жертвуют собой, но они от этого тоже не умирают, как ни странно. Если они мягкие, женственные, то они как резиновые будут, понимаешь, когда как матка чужих там или какая-нибудь там, да, чпоньк, то есть если у нее там ничего, нету никаких зажимов, как Марат бы сказал, да, то есть как у нее там зажимы, то есть ее там все очень умная там, тройное философское что-нибудь там, не знаю. Много книг начитанных и так далее, да. Короче, да, понимаю. Естественно, никогда все так вот, потому что у них биология не мужская просто, понимаешь? Да, ну, по-любому, короче, да, даже богатырство это мужская, то есть вот так вот, это мужская или женская, это не женское, просто не женский образ, да, понимаете? Это просто, поняла тебя просто, да. Ну, она поняла тебя, да, ну, да. Синильный, говорит, синильный. Ну, он про себя так думает, на себя так, да. Отвали уже, я просто тебе объясняю, да, вот это он имеет в виду, что, ну, да. Ну, вроде как так, но, да, понимаешь. Но биология, ты помни про то, что биология отказалась от всех мускулов, даже от волос, то есть, как бы, ну, значит, нам не надо. Ты правильно понял меня, да? То есть, нам это не надо, за это держаться, если ты мужик, тем более умный. То есть, все знают, что ты в обществе ничего не достигнешь, если ты даже тут супер, да, понимаю, да. Ну, оно тебе говорит, да, философ, ну, конечно, философ, да. Но он это имеет в виду.